Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. Should white people today pay for the sins of slavery that was committed 150 years ago? Now, before I unpack this, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section. All comments are welcome. Now, this is a follow-up video to the one I did on Herschel Walker and his comments on reparations. And I want to expand further on this thought, because whenever this subject comes up, it still proves to be a most sensitive subject. Like, as some people will say, especially sometimes about me, that I won't let the wounds heal. And that's not it at all. The wounds are still there. But let me go further. I hear a lot of white people say that why should I have to pay for slavery? My family came in off of the boat. Why should we today, white people or America, pay for the sins of slavery 150 years ago? Now, there are a very few blacks who voice the same. You could probably put them in the category of black conservatives. And to that, I will say, are the blacks who are voicing the same sentiments like Herschel Walker, are they saying it because they are truly informed and are making legitimate points? Or are they saying it because they feel, well, this is what white people want to hear, or I want to be accepted, so I have to say this? Now, to that, I'm going to say all the above and decide, I think, on a case-by-case basis. But nevertheless, there are people who are saying it. And even the white conservatives that I hear, some are making legitimate questions and points. Others, it's usually just a revelation of the racism, latent racism, that's still harbored in their heart. Let me be clear. I'm not saying because you raised the question that you're a racist. But I am going to say that you're seeing this subject through the lens of a white perspective. And the problem is that, do you want to know the truth of the issue, or do you want to hold on to certain biases? Now, that's yet to be seen. But let's kind of back up and deal with several points about this. First, the issue is, should whites today pay for the sins of slavery? They say slavery's been over for 150 years. Why are we still harping on slavery? Haven't we moved on from that? Well, I'm going to list several points, because I'm going to tell you right now, this study, or this subject, we could spend in depth on this forever. Okay? I will spare you, but they are worth the study, because it's not as simple as an answer as you may think. But I'm going to give you certain points to ponder, to say, okay, here's what we need to, here's more information so that we can, I'm going to say, make a better informed or intelligent opinion on and answering the question. So first, let's go back to the issue of slavery ending 150 years ago. The problem with that is, that's not where the problem ended. And though legal slavery did end after a hard-fought war with the largest amount of American casualties. Think about that. You had an entire section of the country who, over slavery, said, I want to succeed. They even had a president, a commander of the armed forces. State succeeded, okay, which caused the Civil War. But here's the problem. We have to kind of go back. The other part of this argument is that people will kind of say, well, Africa sold blacks, right? And since everybody's had slaves, so why are we still harping on this? Again, those are straw man, cop-out arguments. But let's deal with them. Let's go back to 1619 when the first African slaves landed on this soil. America wasn't a nation at the time, but for the next some 15 generations, slaves were not only exported here, or imported here, I should say, but generations of slaves were born here. That brings us to 1776, when the Constitution was enacted. And here's where the guilt comes. In 1776, of course, in fighting the American Revolutionary War to break away from Britain, remember the Founding Fathers wrote this one statement: "We believe that all men are created equal." Let's stop a moment and think about that. We believe that all men are created equal. Well, they were lying, were they not? Because at the same time that they were writing that, many of the Founding Fathers themselves had slaves. And certainly, they did not resolve the slave issue in 1776 based upon that statement alone. We believe that all men are created equal. The other half of that statement, of course, is and are endowed with inalienable rights from their creator. They didn't believe that either because they left black Americans enslaved. Now I do say black Americans. Why? Because in 1776, the white people who were born on this land were engrafted as American citizens. The same kind of rights that engraft others that were granted to other people were denied to black Americans. They were left enslaved. But let's stop for a moment. At this point, we also have to consider the damage done. Remember, the question is, why should we pay? Well, in any kind of lawsuit, by the way, do you know you have to establish damage? So what was the damage done? I never get an answer to this question, by the way, when I ask people who have these opinions. Answer the question for me. What was the damage done to African Americans, black Americans, in slavery? What did it take to make a slave? What was a good slave? How did you have an entire race? Oh, let's back up for a moment. Because remember, the Atlantic slave trade singled out a single race. That sets it apart from any other human slavery experience. So when people say, well, everybody did it, yes, they did. Everybody. Slavery is as old as human history itself. Further, it was black Africans who sold other black Africans in slavery. In other words, if you go over to Africa, what you find is this black slave, this tribe hated this tribe, and if they were strong enough, they enslaved them and then sold some of those slaves to other countries and nations, primarily white men. Here's the other interesting thing. The Atlantic slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, more slaves went to South America than to North America. Why am I making that difference? Because when people say, well, what about the other issue? Why are we harping on this when they don't make this case? I'll make it. It's a statement of history. More slaves went to South America. But here's why America stands alone in its sin. Because America is the only nation in the history that has claimed that all men are created by their creator and endowed by inalienable rights by their creator. That all men are created equal. In other words, remember, America was the only one whose creed was freedom for all, while making violating its very own creed by enslaving a particular race. Now you might say, what about the American Indians and Native Americans and other immigrant groups? Yes, some of them had it hard. But what made America different was, remember, there were laws passed. Can I go back to also the damage? What did it take to make a slave? What do you have to do to a slave? If I was to come to you and say, okay, you know what? You're going to be my slave. I'm just going to assume you're not going to come willingly. So I have to force trauma, brutality. I have to seize control of you. How will I do that? One, beat you, right? Chain you, beat you. In some case, rape. But I'm going to keep beating you. Also, I'm going to work on your mentality. I'm going to say, you're not a human. You're less than a human. This is where the word nigger comes in because, see, remember, nigger was a white word that was used against African Americans. While people complain about the use of the word today, I'm going to say it's kind of a leftover from what? Centuries of what slave masters and the white people referred to as blacks. Why? Because they wanted to make a difference. Okay? They wanted to make a difference. I'm tempted to get into the whole debate about the N-word, but I'll save that for another video. But here's the other thing about then the process of making a slave. You had to break their spirit, break their mind. Now remember, generations then were born after that. The imports of slave had to be broken. Some of them were wild bucks. Think about what happens when they stepped off of a slave boat. Well, let's back up for a moment. So all of a sudden, now think about this. There are people who try to say, well, you black people are the problem because you sold each other in slavery. Okay, and that is true. But what does that make the white man who bought the slaves? You see the problem here? They bought the slaves. Not only did the white man bought the slave, but white Christians who were coming to a white Christian nation, who believed in God, who said on the door, freedom for all, that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights by their Creator. So, whose guilt is more? The heathen blacks swinging from the trees with bones in their noses, right? And I'm being funny, of course, but I'm not being funny because that is, of course, the image that you see of Africa. Whenever you think about Africa, think about this. You think about what? Guys running around with straw, naked or straw skirts around with bones in their noses. All right. But the sophisticated white man bought slaves. The transatlantic travel itself was most brutal because you were chained in the bow of a boat, laying side by side, excrements, urine. A lot of people died themselves from the travel. Now think about this now for a moment, okay? That so then when they got off of the boat, and by the way, many of the shipmasters would rape the women, okay? Torture the men. So those who survived the Atlantic travel across the Atlantic, those who survived then were brought to an auction block where they were stripped naked, oftentimes, and stood up there as property, as animals, inspected. Now remember, they were in chains. They were in chains. What did that do to the emotions of black Americans? What did that do to their mentality? Physicality. What did it do? What did this experience do to them? By the way, this was trauma. Think about that. This was trauma. Also, let's also ask this question. What did it do to white people? Remember, they had to condition themselves that this was okay, despite that we believe all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights from the Creator. What did it do to them? Well, let's think about this. I'll tell you what it did to them. They passed laws, culture. They changed the culture. They even changed science. That's right. What they did with science was they said the African American, the Negro man, was inferior in every way. They said certain things that doesn't feel pain, right? So if I whip them, beat them, work them to death, they don't feel pain. Guess what? They don't have any kind of emotions like us white people. Why would they say something like that? Well, if you snatch their young child from them and sell them away. Or when massa came creeping into the slave quarters, he could sleep with any one of the slave girls, right? And the slave people couldn't say anything. But just ask yourself, if my wife, if a slave master came and raped my wife, my daughter, what mentally did that do to me? What did it mentally do to me? Of course, they've even invented certain laws and even medical conditions, and I kid you not, such as runaway slave syndrome. In other words, they said there was something mentally wrong and emotionally unbalanced for a man who kept trying to run away, who wanted to be free. There were so many laws, I could say, that we can't even get into right now that describe this experience. Now, let me also say this at this point. There were many good whites who spoke out against slavery, and yes, without the God-fearing white people, slavery couldn't end, okay? But the experience, think about this. This went on for from 1776 to 1865. So let's ask a question. After the hard-fought war, now think about the trauma, generational trauma that blacks endured because of slavery. But not only slavery, but even attitudes of whites towards black. There was no area of the United States that blacks didn't suffer from racism. So in 1865, what do you think the condition, the mental condition, the emotional condition, when they said you're free? One of the great abolitionists, Harriet Tubman, said, I could have freed a lot of more slaves if I could have told them about their freedom, if they would accept their freedom. I kind of butchered her quote, y'all. Here's the point. She would run people under what's called the Underground Railroad, but a lot of slaves refused to go. Why? Because they were conditioned. So in 1865, when they were truly free, they didn't have to run, where were they going to go? So let's ask the question. In 1865, Negroes were free. Free to do what? What help did the country give them? What aid? They said these people have been traumatized, right? They've been undeveloped mentally. It was illegal for Africans to read. So how could they better themselves? What kind of education do you think they have? What did this nation do in 1865 to say we need to acclimate these people into society? So ask. Well, there was supposed to be 40 acres and a mule. However, that soon got overtaken by Jim Crow. Well, when 1865 ended and whites could no longer profit from slaves, then Jim Crow happened for another 100 years, which said, you're inferior, stay away from us. They called it separate but equal, but it was nowhere equal. During this time, there was a brutal reign, terror, the Ku Klux Klan, but not only the Klan, but police officers and the law. Thousands of black men were lynched for the minutest things, prison camps, everything. Think about the mentality if you was walking down the street that you could not look a white person in the eye. And God forbid if some person accused you falsely. Many white women did that, which led to many black men being jailed or lynched. But think about the others who kept their place. One of the most missed thing that people say is blacks had it good right then. The black family was intact. Yeah, as long as they stayed on the other side of the track. And by the way, the other side of the tracks, no sidewalks, no paved roads, no plumbing. Okay, but we can move on from there. Okay, so think about this. What was the trauma when we had a nearly 10-year civil rights struggle, marches, right? In 1965, this brings us to 1965, when legal racism was finally ended, for the most part, okay? Legal racism was ended. Let me ask the question again. What was done for the African American to help them? There were generational trauma, the emotions, and their mentality. That you go down south, even to this day, the effects of slavery is still there. People are afraid of white folks. I kid you not. Now there are other generations that are now coming up, but when you think about, well, why do black people act the way they act? There's a whole lot of other factors that time just doesn't allow me to get into. However, let me just say this, that when you say, why should now whites pay for something that happened 150 years ago, I would almost agree with that if it was just that, and if you can ask me what was done 150 years ago. But remember, we came another 100 years. What was done in just 50 years, just a little over 50 years ago in 1965. So the other question is, and especially for us as Christians, what does God think about justice? How does justice look for that? In other words, what white, and I think they're disingenuous to say, let's just leave it alone, blacks just get over it, because in essence, you're saying, get over it. Let me tell you a story. Back in 2013, remember in Cleveland, Ohio, now think about this, in Cleveland, Ohio, it was discovered that a guy by the name of Ariel Castro had held three ladies for 10 years in a slavery type condition. Think about this now. For 10 years, people said all society knew that these girls went missing, but it came to find out they were in slavery. You know, one of the ways he did, he used the various exact tactics to keep them in slavery, mainly in chain. He raped them, he beat them, he would even do tricks on them. You know, get this, he would do tricks on them, like intentionally leave their chains off, and then when they tried to escape, he would beat them. Now, why do I say that? Because he had a daughter with one of the girls, and the daughter came and told, "Oh, the door is open." The one lady had to muster up the courage to try to get out, and that's when things broke, because she went and tried to force her way out. Neighbors heard, helped her. Okay, but the other two, this is what I wanted to show you. The other two stayed in the room because what? Mentally, they were conditioned. Now watch this. As a result of that, Ohio paid those girls because of the negligence of Ohio. In other words, the fact that things that they probably should have done that they didn't do. In other words, Ohio felt that they were negligent and paid them millions. Now think about this. In addition to that, there was help given to them. Counseling, psychology, all of that to help them what? Get to acclimate back into society. They've been slaves for 10 years. Here's my point. Ohio said they were wrong. Think about this. America was wrong for what it did to black Americans. And it wasn't just 50 years ago. Remember, the argument is 150 years ago, and that's, to me, it's a disingenuous argument to say. It was much, much closer. And then even then in 1965, what was done? We still have people who hate black Americans and who are actively working against it. You have people right now working on things such as voter suppression. That's just an example. But we still have redlining. You still have police issues that we are experiencing today. There's a lot that we could talk about. But here's my point. Should white Americans pay for something that happened 150 years ago? Yes, if what happened 150 years ago hasn't been rectified. You see, crime and wrong doesn't go away because time and convenience. Okay? If you are part of an organization that did wrong, guess what? You are going to be involved in that to some degree. Let me give you another example. Because reparations were paid. Now think about this. Reparations were paid to slave owners for the loss of their slaves. We paid Japanese, right, for what America did to Japanese Americans. not Japanese foreigners, but Japanese America during the war. They took their property away. They put them in camps. It was wrong. They were paid. And guess what? They should have. Native Americans. And I would say maybe not as much as they should, but have you seen the kind of land that Native Americans have? My point is, they were paid something. Why? Because America did Native Americans wrong. It seems that the only people that people have a problem with making it right with is black people. And I wonder why. Because remember, they were conditioned too that, hey, the treatment of blacks was okay, whether it was slavery and Jim Crow. Let me give you this on the list right here. Because this is another point that I'm going to say. During slavery, there were companies, institutions, schools, and families who profited and gotten their wealth as a direct result of slavery. Some of that wealth was passed on through the generations. I'm just going to give you a few companies. New York Life, think about this. New York Life Insurance. People hear that. Tiffany and Company. These are the names you will hear today. Aetna. Okay? Aetna Insurance. Brook Brothers. Norfolk Southern Railroad. Bank of America. US Today. Wachova. AIG. JP Morgan Chase. That's just a few names where they got their wealth doing slavery, and guess what? They are still enjoying that wealth that came as a direct result of slavery. The question is, should white Americans pay? I would also say this. It's not so much as white America is paying as much as the nation is paying to make it right. And isn't that the Christian thing to do? Let me give you one example, a biblical example, two biblical examples. I'll give you two. God told the Israelite that, hey, I'm going to set you guys free. When you do, I want you to go and ask your Egyptian neighbors for jewelry, for money, for all kinds of stuff. As a result of that, as they were leaving, they left with a whole bunch of plunder from the Egyptians. Here's another good example that goes directly to the answer to the question. Does God hold responsible today's generation for past sins? Now, some people will say, well, are you asking my son to pay for my sins? Again, it's not about you paying for your father's sins, but we're talking about the nations. And that's exactly what God did with David. God held David's generation. He said, you have to make what Saul did, your predecessor, right. Saul did some wicked things to some people, and God said, you know what? There was a plague that came on the land, and David went and go, why are we in this plague? And God said, because of what Saul did. That's why. And so here's my thing right here. Does America need to make it right? Yes. And I would also agree that when you say, let me just put it like this way, critical race theory and those kinds of concepts, critical race theory like that, critical race theory, that's another discussion. I don't agree with it. And also, I don't think it solves anything either. And that's not the way to go. But simple making things right in the simple way, that's what I'm talking about. All right, guys, look, that's my perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. Till next time, I'll see you then.